My guest today is Eric von Hippel, Professor of Technological Innovation at the MIT Sloan School of Management. Eric is the author of numerous academic articles and books, including Free Innovation, Democratizing Innovation, and The Sources of Innovation, all published by the MIT Press and available for free. Eric has accumulated over 90,000 citations on Google Scholar and has received many awards, including the Schumpeter School Prize, a particularly interesting recognition given his work on non-Schumpeterian innovation. In our conversation, Eric and I explore the role of free innovation in today's economy. Eric highlights some of his favorite examples of free innovation and discusses how, despite being developed at personal cost, free innovation is scaling at an impressive rate. We explore the mechanisms that best enable this scaling, whether through recognition, institutional support, IP protection, or alternative incentives. By the end of this talk, you will know what free innovation is, how it develops, how it interacts with producer innovation, and how rules and standards are shaping this interaction. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Welcome on the podcast. I'm so pleased to have you as a guest. Just for the sake of clarity, our good friend Jason Potts introduced me to you, so I'm most grateful to Jason. And I suggest we get started. I've divided the conversation into two different parts. In part one, I want to talk about the concept of free innovation and then see with you what it means for AI. You have papers on open source systems, so you have already formed and expressed a couple thoughts, but I do want to see if we can now apply that to generative AI and all of the buzzwords of 2025. So to get started and to give us a sense of what we're going to talk about today, if you could provide us with a couple examples of free innovation developed by users that you find to be surprising or the most fascinating, I guess this would help us to get a good sense of our conversation today.
Okay. So the term free innovation largely applies to consumers who develop innovations for themselves, and they give them away free because they don't sell them. Now, an example of such a thing is that one can make an improvement to a bicycle. For example, mountain bikes were developed by users, and they developed them because they wanted to use them. Then later, manufacturers said, oh, well, we see now there's a market for these things, and we see that they've been improved. We'll manufacture them. Now, that's a sport, but user innovation is done in every area where users have a need. So, for example, at the start of the book Free Innovation, we talked about parents of type 1 diabetic children who were trying to improve the way that insulin is administered to their kids. Their kids paid absolutely no attention to readings or anything else. They were just running around playing football. And so the parents had to find a way to monitor what the blood levels were with these kids and improve the system. Again, in both cases, these are people using and developing an innovation for their own purposes. They're not trying to sell it. So they are happy to give it away for free.
You do mention that example of the insulin and also the mountain bikes in the book. And I was wondering, are you a user of mountain bikes?
No, I have students who are very interested in extreme sports. And so they're the ones who, it's really good to have somebody study something they really understand.
Yeah.
So they say, oh man, I like kite surfing or whatever. You say, fine, let's study kite surfing. So no, I wasn't a mountain biker, but I know a bit about it now.
Okay, yeah. You do also mention kayaking, and I had the same kind of questioning.
The kayaking was, again, a PhD student postdoc of mine who loved rodeo kayaking or whitewater kayaking. So
okay, fair enough. So in that book, Free Innovation, you define the concept of free innovation as innovation that is, one, developed by consumers at their private cost during their unpaid discretionary time, and which means that no one is paying for them, basically. And two, that is not protected by its developer, meaning that it can be potentially acquired by anyone for free without any payments. Now, at first sight, it seems that this type of free innovation is not scalable because it feels like it depends on individuals too much, and this will be something very local. But in the book, you do explain that the more it goes, the more free innovation actually competes with producer innovation. You give some numbers and show that in some countries there are millions of free innovators. In the US, it's about 5% of the adult population. In the UK, it's about 6%. But I'm interested at the speed at which free innovation is indeed competing against producer innovation. Do we get a sense of whether indeed it is now more of a competition? How big is the movement, I guess, now compared to 20 years ago, let's say?
Well, it's increasing. The amount of user innovation by consumers is increasing because their tools are getting better. They have free design tools that are of equal quality to what producers have. They have cheap prototyping by things like 3D printers and so on. Both of them, they're not competing with each other necessarily. That is, if I develop a mountain bike and I have the design out there for free, a producer can pick it up and sell it. And that's a saving for the producer. The producer not only sees that there is a mountain bike, but they also see that people are adopting it. So they've done their market research in advance, in effect. Mountain bikers all built their own mountain bikes because they needed them and they weren't available commercially. When finally producers came around and started to build them, the bikers were delighted because they wanted to ride the damn things, not build them. And so you'll see this everywhere. The reason that it is large in scale as a consumer innovation phenomenon is that you'll have a bunch of users hearing about somebody developing a mountain bike and saying, I want to do that too. And so then they modify and contribute. In that sense, it's very analogous to open source software. Somebody starts out the project because they have a need. Other people say, oh, I need that too, and pile in. And the scale starts to compete with producer development scale.
And now, of course, as you also mentioned in the book, it's very hard to quantify how many grown-up adults in the United States and elsewhere are indeed engaging in free innovation, because not everyone will talk about it and make it known.
We did nationally representative surveys because in order to get economists to take this thing seriously, you had to show it was a big phenomenon. And so now in 10 nations, we've used a standardized survey. And as a result of these evidences of how huge consumer innovation is, tens of millions of people spending tens of billions of dollars a year, the OECD has now changed the definition it uses for innovation to include this source.
Yeah, which is big. And you do make a reference to the Oslo manual that the OECD puts out. And indeed, the definition used to be very producer-centric and now has evolved. There is this good quote that I already used on the podcast by Charlie Munger, who once said, show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome. Now, if we consider what it does to user innovation, one example that comes to mind might be Gmail, where the employee reportedly already had kind of the concept of Gmail before working for Google, then starts working for Google and it gets adopted, and now it's a success story. And I assume that that person got quite a big reward for that. And it leads me to the question. One of the way user innovation and producers interact is that they may indeed be adopted and become a commercial producer innovation. Is that the best way to create incentives for user to innovate? you seem to suggest that not necessarily, that IP rights are also not necessarily absolutely essential. So is it just that people will get recognition? Is it more of a social kind of incentive that they get out of it? Or is it something we can't really measure?
Yeah. So we have now studied also the motivations of these users. And we find that a big fraction of it is personal use. Another big component, now we're talking about, let's take the average consumer user innovating in his own time. So big fraction is I want it because I want to use it. Another big fraction is that I want to learn or enjoy the innovation process. It's a form of consumption. It's like when somebody goes down to their basement to put a supercomputer into an Altoid tin just for fun. Well, that's fun, right? So they do it for fun. They do it for altruism and, to help others. But this mix of motives is direct self-reward. So some subset of them may say, oh, I want to sell this. But for most, it's use-related rewards. It's self-rewards. Let me give you an example from my personal experience. So I had a tendon strained in my leg, and I went to the surgeon, and he said, well, you have to wear this big boot, sort of like a ski boot. You have to wear this big boot and come back and see me in 3 months, and it'll have settled down, and you'll be just fine. So I tried to walk out of the office with it, and I said, Christ, I can hardly move. He said, yeah, not my problem. So I went home, and I looked at where my tendon anchored, the one that I was trying to protect and so on, and I realized that I could put a hinge in this damn thing because it was okay to flex my ankle, even though the boot restricted it. My tendon would still be rested. So I did that, and then I was able to teach and move around and all the rest of that. I went back to the surgeon. I said, hey, surgeon, I did this. And he said, oh, yeah, that's a hell of a lot better than what we have. And I said, fine, you can have it. My utility is done. I don't want to stop being a professor and start being a medical equipment producer. Opportunity costs, right? And he said, well, I want to keep on doing surgery. So unless you can get it FDA approved, let's forget it. Now, presumably a company that made those boots might or might not be interested. But the channel to production, right, is not my concern when I'm the innovator, nor is protecting it via patent, which costs a bunch of money. Why would I do that? Why would I, if somebody else's kid is suffering from diabetes, why would I say, oh, no, sorry, I'm patenting this. It's used for my kid, not yours. The whole thing is ludicrous because what we're talking about is self-reward. And we have measured that. It doesn't mean that the commercial system that follows for diffusion can't take advantage and get benefit out of what I have done or other innovators have done. But I don't care.
Going a step even further and you sending a letter to medical equipment manufacturers is a personality trait, or is it driven by something else that we can also measure?
What you'll find is that in some fields, there is an incentive to diffuse because altruism is built in. So, for instance, vegans invent new recipes and so on for themselves, but they also want to save the world, right, by converting others to veganism. So they regularly find it in their self-interest to invest energy in telling others about it. In the case of the biking field, again, it's sort of the social dynamics of sports. People get together. They see your bike is really pretty cool. They say, hey, how are you doing that?
That makes me think about what Adam Smith wrote quite a long time ago in the theory of the moral sentiment. Is it somehow related to be loved and to be lovely and indeed not to be a dork, to use more modern terms?
I think people regularly help each other. This whole thing in business schools of tying up innovation to making money is really restricting our understanding of innovation in a not useful way. So our students are regularly taught, oh, if you have an idea, patent it right away, hide it, don't let anybody know. Well, that's not how most of us operate in the consumer sector. Normally we share. Now, there are about 5% who actually say, I started out as a user innovator for my own entertainment, but now I see that I want to sell this thing. And then the commercial motive comes in. And I'll tell you another story related to this. You know those baby joggers that you see, joggers running around with their babies in this thing?
I know those, and I was one of those dads just a year ago.
Ah, okay. Well, that was invented by a dad. And the dad was told by his wife, stroll the baby. And there was no baby jogger, so he would have to walk. And he said, I want to go for a run. And she said, let me clarify, stroll the baby or die. He said, that's a more serious matter. So he went to the garage and he took the wheels off his bikes that the kids had outgrown. He built this baby jogger and went running around. Now, every other dad on his run stopped him and said, Jesus, I need one of those. And he said, okay, I'll make it into a business. So in that case, he converted from a user innovator. It was clear he did it to avoid death and dismemberment and to stroll his baby, as it were. But he evolved into, I'll start to sell this stuff.
You know, on my commute here to the campus, I listen to podcasts and I also watch Shark Tank quite a lot. And that's how most of those businesses that they pitch, or at least that's what they say, get started. It was for their personal use, and they figured out, well, I may actually make a buck or two out of that. So let me come back now to those interactions between the free innovators and producers. You explain in the book that there are 4 types of interactions. First, they may compete. Examples include the Apache free web competing with Microsoft Server software. Apache, by the way, has a bigger market share, just saying. Anyway, that's way number 1. Number 2, the user innovation may complement the innovation diffused by the producers. Third, they may spill over, meaning that eventually the producer will adopt what the user came up with. And 4, the producers may support free innovation. We see that Google do a little bit of that. We talk about it, but Meta is also doing a little bit of that when it comes to AI. Now, my question is this. Do we have evidence that one of these 4 interactions will be becoming more popular today than others? And if so, why? Do we have a sense of that?
Well, I think that it's, for example, in the Apache case that you mentioned and measuring how many people use which kind of server software versus Microsoft, it's very difficult to measure the amount of free use because downloads aren't measured very well. So I think it was Greenstein did that study with much effort to say, oh, look how much free software is downloaded. So they do compete, obviously, but unless one is somehow clocking downloads, it's hard to know what the competition is. Now, with respect to another one, the one you mentioned about compliments, I think that's very important because let's stick with the mountain bike story. The companies had a way to adopt the mountain bike and profit by scale, right? And so I, as a user, would want to buy the bike because it's easier than sitting in my basement and building another one. But an essential complement to the bike itself that gives its value is the techniques you use in riding it. Those users jump. They do all sorts of crazy things, right? That's all user developed, but manufacturers really can't make any money from it. It's what I call a system of use, where both components are necessary, but only one really makes a market for a company. All of this is very much the specific comparative advantage we're talking about. Difficult to measure because it's free. I would say, as a proponent of free and user innovation, yes, it's huge. It's going to take over the universe. Producers will all wither and die, but I don't know that. It's possible that users will wither and die, but I doubt that too.
Yeah, that's what we've heard many times, but at least it exists, and that we know. And if you only cover the Schumpeterian kind of innovation and totally put aside user innovation, you are missing part of the story.
Oh, you're missing a huge part.
Let me ask about the interplay between the user innovations and then eventually the producers coming in to scale whatever innovation the users came up with. You have find evidence that the producers' profits and social welfare, both, are generally increased if the producers invest less in the kind of innovation that free innovators find it viable to develop. Now, moving on to where I'm most comfortable, talking about merger control, a lot of what we hear when companies want to merge and have to ask for the permission, they say, well, if we merge, then we actually will be in a position to come up with innovation that potentially could be, yes, a substitute for what free innovators can actually do. And it seems to be a very poor argument because you do prove that it will decrease social welfare, or at least it's not the best way to increase it. So if that is true, how can we make the policymakers and the regulators in a position so that they can actually investigate whether or not indeed free innovators have already invested the space and whether they find it viable?
So the users innovate for their own purposes. They, as I mentioned a minute ago, they developed the first XYZ. Producers, however, also innovate, but in a different way. So what I was saying in the book was producers should not try to do what users do because A, they don't do it very well, and B, users are already investing there. Now, a company could say, well, yes, but if we are merged, we will do more innovation. Well, they may or may not, but the kind of innovation that producers do is the kind of innovation called dimension of merit. There's a division of labor between user and producer innovators. As I said, the user makes the first of a kind. They make the first center pivot irrigation. They make the first heart-lung machine. They make the first skateboard. But then the manufacturer comes along and says, aha, I know now that there's a demand for skateboards or heart-lung machines. I will make them more energy efficient. I will make them more reliable. I will make them easier to clean. I will make them cheaper. Those are dimensions of merit in the sense that the producer doesn't have to understand anything new about the precise user circumstances. They don't have to, if the user invents the airplane, oh, okay, I'll make a bigger one and at half the price. So I don't buy the argument that producers will do better at innovation when they merge, now to get to your point, because they don't do much. What they do is of the dimension of merit form, but they really, by and large, don't do much because they don't compete. They're full of middle managers. It's all pretty much a wasteland.
So they may have a case in saying, okay, we'll make what exists more efficient, more sustainable, which is valid. I mean, we need that by all means. But to say I'm going to disrupt and come up with something entirely new is less of a convincing argument based on empirical evidence.
That's right. And also there was a study specifically of what the definition of disruptive is unclear.
Yeah.
But there was a study that took all those adherents of Clay Christensen and took all their innovations to find out where the disruptive innovations came from, and over half came from innovating users. So again, pioneering is generally done by users.
All right. So now that we've reached that point in the conversation, we can move on to part 2, in which we try to see what it all means for AI.
All right.
Now you have, I quote you here, users will reveal innovations when their benefits outweigh their costs. If we apply that to AI, we see that large companies are investing in open source systems, which may be more surprising than small networks of passionate users. And yet they do. It maybe is surprising because the cost of the large tech companies are much higher than the cost of a single individual. Now, they may be doing it for philosophical reasons because they believe in openness. But if we look more closely, what we see in AI, at least it seems to me, is that they hope that by commoditizing AI, they will actually cut the grass under the feet of their competitors and prevent them from making money, which is a good potential strategy. And two, if they already have existing technologies, they can integrate an AI system that has benefited from the inputs of users and make money that way, right? This is Meta integrating AI into Instagram, and they make money that way, not so much using AI per se. Now, building on your work, do you think that user innovation has a significant role to play in the development of the new AI models? Or do you think we've passed that stage already and we are already at the stage where we need the producers to be able to scale AI?
So AI as a tool is something where it's going to diffuse down to the level of individuals who can use these things privately on their phones or their PCs. And so it's a tool to do something, and companies will benefit, I assume, by trying to sell you access to this tool. It will empower users as well as producer innovators to do more of what they do. We were talking earlier about communication amongst users and diffusion. Well, users nowadays often talk to each other on the web. So you can search for something, for instance, specialist communities in heart-lung machines or whatever, and people will say, hey, I had this problem and I solved it. You can trap those. Maybe they made an innovation. And then you can also look at search term frequencies and see which ones of those are gaining traction. So you have an efficient way to see the mountain bike when it's early and to see how rapidly it's growing, to see when the interface should switch from user to producer.
But do you think this is benefiting producers because they can actually detect trends earlier?
Yeah, it's benefiting producers. It's also benefiting users because they can use the tool to find each other.
Yeah.
And also see what's the trend.
And create larger networks.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the output of generative AI. We take ChatGPT, Claude, any other kind of models, and try to see what it means for user innovation and outputs. I've heard convincing arguments on both sides, so I'm curious to hear what you think about that. On the one hand, I hear that generative AI will empower users to compete with larger structures. One example, I guess, is this podcast. I can edit the podcast using AI, mix the podcast using AI. I do not need a studio or sound engineer. It's far from perfect, but it's better than what it would have been just 5 years ago. So it empowers me as a user. On the other end, we hear that AI will actually enable those who already are famous in a way to produce even more and to saturate the market. One of my favorite podcasts is Acquired. And repeatedly, they've been saying that they use AI to mix their episodes, which means they need less time to prepare a new episode. And of course, I'm unable to compete with them. So is AI a good way to scale user innovation and outputs, or is it not?
Are you thinking of yourself as a user innovator? You're a producer. Or are you thinking of yourself as a user innovator, as a podcaster?
Well, I was thinking user innovator because it's on my free time. I'm not being paid for it. It's a way for me to get in touch with people such as yourself. So that's what I derive from it. There is no financial incentives. As opposed to Acquired, again, my favorite podcast out there, but they make money out of it and that's their way of living. And it's on a different scale. I mean, much different scale.
You see, What the AI is built upon is a general training set, and I have my own internal training set, and I can combine the two in a way that's not available to others. Each of us can. So it empowers me. It's a form of cognitive offloading. It's about brain do what it has to do with help. So when a kid counts on his fingers, that's cognitive offloading. It's keeping track of sums for the kid. Same way the computer is there, right? The computers today are helping us do research we could never otherwise do.
The core of my question is whether then the computer will provide more assistance to user innovators or producer innovators. And let's take a music artist as an example. It is clear that if the sound quality is very bad, it is unlikely you will become a big star. Let's assume that's the objective. Now, AI is enabling people to record in their bedroom and make it sound like it was recorded in the proper studio. So in a sense, it benefits them very much. But Taylor Swift may also use AI to produce even more music and saturate the market. So it benefits the larger players as well. So that's where I'm getting at. Do you see that it will benefit user innovators maybe more than big producers?
It's the same as sort of the mountain bike story where regular road bikes are produced until mountain bikes become big. If a user uses AI to generate something novel that doesn't have a market yet, that user would have an incentive because they can get a reward from not many albums. The producer doesn't want to flood a space where nobody is yet, and it hasn't been defined, because nobody gives a damn. So each side will use it according to their incentives.
Let me ask a final question. You tackle legal issues and policy implications in most of your books and your academic articles. Now, what you suggest is that we may want to change a bit the intellectual property landscape because policymakers may have the impression that the inventors value IP, intellectual property, a lot, and that's the sole reason why they are innovating, when in fact, as we discussed, not so much. Now, what is your take on the training of AI models? Do you think it's okay for IP to create the barriers to entry and to train the models, or should we say it's fair use? Go ahead, use any content you want.
I think the more general argument is, when is IP useful? I don't pretend to know the details of how it affects the market of a person with a style. That's one of the arguments. It copied my style, right? This is how I do a painting or a song. Learned just as an original painter would. A student painter learns from Rembrandt and so on. What IP does is it stops other people from actions they might otherwise take. It's saying, I invented this, you can't mess with it. So, maybe one can argue in the case of developing drugs or something, but in general, for the day-to-day innovation that's going on in electronics and so on, it's nuts. And it's been knocked out of, as you know, it's been knocked out. You can't patent software anymore. And everybody's doing fine.
And when it comes to AI, you see the same dynamics as the one we see 30 years ago.
Yeah.
It's not that the big players, they don't want IP, quite the contrary. They want IP to protect what they have or may have. Maybe a final question. If one goes to your Google Scholar page, that person will see that 2024 was pretty active. You have a lot of publications ongoing. So what is the most exciting thing you are researching nowadays?
Well, there's several things, but one certainly is that China is so outracing us, and they're innovating, but they're innovating in small increments, which in fact, in studies that have been done over here, the big innovations have much less impact than the collection of small ones. So again, I'm in awe of their system. It just rushes ahead. And I find, when I tour the corridors of MIT and I say, what are you building there? Because they're all working on things. And they say, oh, yeah, well, I've got this test board here and so on. I said, where'd you get it? There's PC shops down the street. Yeah, but it's a lot faster and cheaper to get it from China. So they can build things so quickly and cheaply, and they have a system set up for that. High variation allowed, it's just fine. It's going to eat our lunch, and it should. So that's one. And also I'm studying sort of systems of use and innovations in technique versus, which are not counted, versus innovations in products, which are. The example I gave you earlier about the mountain bike, where all the things like jumping and the rest, that goes into the economic statistics as recreation time, consumption. So we're going to show basically another huge chunk of innovation that contributes to social welfare is being ignored. So that's another one.
All right, that's exciting. So I'll make sure to link to all of your books. All of them are freely accessible online. So they will appear in the show notes. And I'll keep an eye on your upcoming publications and we'll make sure to share them.
Okay.
On that good note, to everyone out there, take care of yourself. And if you can, someone else too. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.